time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
The decision was already written when Harry learned that his place inside the royal structure had changed forever. There was no public warning, no ceremonial confrontation, and no opportunity for negotiation. King Charles had approved the revocation of Harry's prince title, but the most explosive detail was hidden behind that final signature. William had quietly influenced the king before the decision was made, turning a family fracture into a constitutional reckoning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry stared at the page without moving. The royal order, a formal instruction issued under the sovereign's authority, stated in plain terms that he would no longer use the designation of prince in an official capacity. His place in the line of succession remained untouched, unless changed separately, but that distinction offered little comfort. He had carried the title since birth, through childhood, military service, marriage, departure, and years of bitter separation. Now one of his last visible links to the institution had been cut away by his own father. Harry reached the final paragraph, then read it again. No qualification appeared. No temporary wording softened the blow. He set the document down and said nothing, but the silence carried more anger than an outburst could have. The title had always been more than protocol to him. It was part of how the world had known him, part of the identity he inherited before he was old enough to understand what inheritance meant. Charles sat elsewhere with a duplicate copy before him, burdened rather than relieved. The king had signed the order not as a father seeking revenge, but as a monarch who believed compromise had reached its limit. For years, he had tried to separate personal affection from royal responsibility. This time, the two had collided, and responsibility had won. William's role made the decision even more explosive. Days before the signature, the prince had spoken privately with his father, with no wider family gathering and no protective circle of relatives around them. He did not simply approve the outcome afterward. He helped shape the argument that persuaded Charles the decision could no longer be delayed. That hidden intervention changed everything. William's concern had grown from years of personal wounds, institutional fears, and one specific moment that convinced him ambiguity had become dangerous. Harry had lost the title, but the deeper story was now about why his brother had pushed the king toward the point of no return. To understand that, the story must move beyond the signature and into the relationships that made it possible in the first place. Before this became a battle over titles, it was a battle between two brothers who once shared grief, duty, and the strange isolation of royal childhood. William and Harry had spent decades being defined together, but adulthood placed them on opposite sides of the monarchy's future. Now one brother stood closer than ever to the crown, while the other faced the loss of the title that had followed him since birth. William carried a burden Harry no longer shared. As heir to the throne, the prince was expected to protect the stability of the monarchy he would one day inherit, and that meant thinking beyond personal hurt. The crown, meaning the continuing authority and responsibilities of the monarchy, rather than simply the physical crown worn at ceremonies, demanded consistency. Every public title, role, and connection had to mean something clear. William understood that more sharply with each passing year, even when that clarity came at a painful cost. Harry stood on the other side of that divide. He remained Charles's son and remained tied to royal history by birth, memory, and family. Yet he had stepped away from the daily structure that once defined his place. That separation made the prince title more emotionally important, not less. It had become one of the last symbols connecting him to the world he had left behind, and losing it now felt like something deeper than an administrative change. William felt that truth before he ever approached his father. Alone before the private conversation, he rehearsed the opening sentence in his head, stopped, and began again. He knew he was not discussing a distant courtier, or an abstract constitutional problem. He was preparing to raise the future of his younger brother. That knowledge slowed him, but it did not change the conclusion he had reached. Harry's hurt hardened the moment he understood William had been involved. The loss itself struck at identity, but his brother's influence transformed the wound into something personal. He could accept that the king had authority. What he struggled to accept was that William had quietly helped persuade Charles to use it against him. Charles had resisted that path longer than the future king wanted. The monarch had repeatedly separated his duty as sovereign from his instinct as a father, refusing to erase every remaining symbol connecting Harry to the family. William, however, feared that leaving a powerful royal designation attached indefinitely to someone outside active royal duty would keep creating confusion over who could appear to speak with the monarchy's authority. That fear had existed for years, but fear alone had not been enough. One later incident would give William the argument he needed and force Charles to reconsider the line he had refused to cross. The brothers' estrangement had created the pressure, but pressure alone could not force the king's hand. That required a trigger sharp enough to turn hesitation into action. Every royal rupture has a moment people later identify as the point when repair became almost impossible. In this story, it was not a television interview or a public ceremony. It was a private reception at St. James's Palace, where an apparently small dispute over royal representation escalated behind closed doors. By the end of that evening, William believed Harry's remaining title had become more than a family inheritance. It had become a constitutional liability. William had tolerated the uneasy arrangement for years, but that night something changed. Harry was no longer a working royal, yet his birth title still carried enormous international recognition and an implied closeness to the crown. Royal representation meant appearing to act with the authority or backing of the monarchy, and that distinction mattered because the palace had repeatedly tried to separate Harry's private work from official royal business. Charles had resisted touching the title precisely because he knew how permanent such a step would feel. William's concern sharpened during the reception. He learned that Harry's office had sought wording in formal materials for an overseas charitable initiative that palace advisors believed could suggest an official royal role. The language looked small on paper, but the future king saw the larger danger immediately. If audiences abroad could not easily tell whether Harry was speaking privately or with royal authority, then every future appearance risked reopening the same dispute. William confronted a senior aide once the reception ended. He kept his voice controlled, but his frustration was unmistakable. Why, he asked, was the difference between private activity and royal representation still being treated as negotiable? The aide explained that Harry's title complicated every effort to draw a clean line, because the name itself carried expectations the palace could not simply switch off. Charles heard the argument later that night. William told his father privately that ambiguity had become the real problem. If the palace constantly had to explain what Harry's title did not mean, then the title itself was creating confusion the monarchy was trying to prevent. The king rejected revocation at first. He saw it as too severe, too personal, and too final. William did not push with anger. Instead, he asked one question that stayed with Charles long after the conversation ended. What would happen when the same problem reached the next reign? When the king was no longer there to manage it personally? That possibility struck harder than accusation ever could. Charles carried the question away without answering. William had not won the argument, but he had changed its shape. Before the crown could move, father and heir would now have to face each other without advisors, ceremony, or escape. The confrontation did not begin with raised voices. It began with a question. Charles looked across the room at William and asked what, exactly, his eldest son was asking him to do. The answer carried consequences neither man could pretend were administrative. William was asking the king to take away something Harry had possessed since childhood, and Charles understood that once he did it, no private reconciliation could fully restore what had been lost. Charles kept the meeting private because the choice had moved beyond advice. No wider family circle sat between them. No one could soften the language. Sovereign judgment meant the personal decision of the monarch when only the king had the authority to approve the final action. And now that responsibility sat entirely with him. William knew the monarchy was becoming smaller and more tightly defined, which made every royal symbol more important. In his view, a title had to match an active role, or it risked becoming a source of permanent confusion. Charles finally asked the question again. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" William answered carefully. He wanted the palace to remove the prince designation rather than keep issuing explanations every time Harry's royal identity appeared beside private work. The future king did not speak as though he were winning an argument. He spoke like someone accepting that whatever happened next would damage something personal. Charles pushed his chair back and looked away. Harry was still his son. That truth landed harder than any constitutional argument, and the king said it plainly. William did not challenge him. He answered that this was precisely why anger could not decide the matter. If the move was made, it had to be because Charles believed the distinction was necessary for the monarchy, not because the family had failed to heal. William then gave his father the argument that changed the room. Charles could leave the problem untouched and pass it into the next reign, forcing his eldest son to make the same decision later. Or he could settle it himself, while he still had the authority, the history, and the personal relationship needed to own the consequences. Charles did not agree. Not yet. He ended the conversation without giving William an answer, but he also did something far more significant than rejection. The king asked for the legal and constitutional papers to be brought to him privately. William left without knowing whether he had persuaded his father. Charles remained behind with a harsher truth now impossible to avoid. Influence could shape the decision, but only the king could make it irreversible. William had made his case. Charles now had to live with it. No advisor, lawyer, or family member could carry the final burden for him. Preserve Harry's title, and the ambiguity would survive into the next reign. Remove it, and the king would permanently alter the identity of his youngest son. The decision had narrowed to one signature, but William's reasoning was already pressing against every hesitation Charles still carried. Charles read the proposed order alone. The briefing papers beside it covered royal usage, precedent, public representation, and the future shape of a smaller monarchy. Precedent meant earlier royal decisions that could guide how the institution handled a new problem, while public representation concerned who could appear to act with royal authority. Those details mattered because the king was not deciding only what Harry should be called. He was deciding how clearly the monarchy would separate family connection from official responsibility. Charles removed his glasses and left the pen untouched. For several minutes, he did nothing. The monarch could remember Harry as a child and still understand why the present situation demanded clarity, and that tension made the page heavier than any legal wording could show. A father saw the son. A sovereign saw the consequence. Neither side of him could completely silence the other. William waited elsewhere and chose not to contact his father again. The prince understood that another message, another argument, even another carefully chosen sentence could make persuasion feel like pressure. He had already said what he believed. Now he had to allow Charles to decide whether the monarchy truly required the step he had proposed. Charles returned to the draft and changed one line himself. He removed wording that sounded punitive and replaced it with language focused on constitutional clarity and the difference between family identity and official status. Constitutional clarity meant making the roles and authority inside the monarchy easy to understand. The alteration revealed something important. The king was willing to act. but he refused to make the order sound like revenge. Charles picked up the pen at last. He signed. William's private argument had now entered royal history, even though the public would not yet know how decisive his influence had been. The king had made the decision his own, and that mattered. Persuasion had ended. Sovereign authority had spoken. But the order could not remain private for long. Harry still had to learn what his father had done, and what his brother had helped set in motion. A signature had taken only seconds. The consequences would begin the moment Harry understood there was nothing left to stop. Harry had lived through public criticism, family distance, and repeated battles over what remained of his royal identity. This was different. The document before him did not invite negotiation. It did not ask for cooperation. It informed him that the title he had carried since birth had been formally withdrawn by his father. Yet the line that cut deepest was not about Charles. It was confirmation that William had argued for the decision before the king signed it. Harry read the wording carefully, then reached the section explaining how the change would now be used in practice. Future palace statements would no longer style him as prince, and official communications would follow the new designation fixed by the king's order. That mattered because royal styling is more than a name on a page. It signals who visibly stands within the active structure of the monarchy. Harry understood that the practical change might seem small to outsiders, but symbolically, it placed a harder boundary around the life he had once occupied. Harry looked up sharply when William's involvement was confirmed. He asked whether his brother had personally requested the revocation. The question came quickly, but the emotion behind it was heavier than anger alone. He had expected disagreement from William. He had expected distance. What he had not expected was to discover that the future king had gone directly to Charles and helped build the case for taking the title away. Harry's anger turned almost immediately toward his father. William had always been the more predictable source of tension, but Charles had still represented the final barrier. Somewhere beneath years of conflict, Harry had believed the king would refuse to cross that line. Learning that he had signed anyway made the decision feel less like another royal dispute and more like a permanent personal judgment. Harry then heard the detail that complicated everything. Charles had not agreed immediately. He had resisted the proposal, questioned its severity, and only later accepted William's argument about future constitutional clarity. The knowledge did not soften the loss, but it changed its meaning. This had not been a sudden act of temper. His father had thought about it, struggled with it, and then chosen it. Harry did something palace advisors had not expected. He said nothing publicly. That silence unsettled everyone more than an immediate statement might have. Staff had prepared for anger, accusations, even a direct challenge. Instead, Harry withheld his response, and in that pause another possibility emerged. The crown had spoken through documents and decisions, but the next turning point would happen without papers between them. Only two brothers forced to confront what had finally been lost. For years, almost every dispute between William and Harry had been surrounded by something larger than themselves. Staff, statements, interviews, advisors, duty, distance. This time, there was none of that. Their private conversation began without an audience and without a document on the table. Harry wanted one answer. Had William truly believed removing his title was necessary? The response would not repair their relationship, but it would strip away the last illusion surrounding the decision. Harry spoke first. The order had already been approved, so there was nothing left to bargain over, and no wording left to change. That made the conversation more painful, because both brothers knew the outcome was fixed. William entered knowing Charles had taken responsibility as king, yet he also understood that his brother deserved to hear directly why he had intervened, rather than learning everything through palace language. Harry asked the question that had been building since he received the news. Had William wanted to humiliate him? The prince did not answer defensively. He said humiliation had never been the purpose. He wanted a permanent separation between family connection and public royal authority, meaning a clear line between being related to the monarch and appearing to act with the institution's official backing. Harry pushed back immediately. He told William that the distinction might look clean on paper, but it could never erase what the title had meant to him. He had carried it as Diana's son, as Charles's son, and as his brother. The loss reached into family memory, not just protocol. William listened without dismissing him, because he knew that whatever institutional logic stood behind the decision, the emotional cost was real. William then admitted what had finally changed his thinking. The St. James's Palace incident convinced him the same confusion would keep returning unless the monarchy created a boundary no one could misunderstand. He had not acted because of one angry argument or a sudden burst of resentment. The future king had accepted the damage because he believed leaving the issue unresolved would make the next reign even harder. Harry understood the truth, and it hurt more because it was deliberate. His brother had not lost control. He had thought it through. That realization did not produce reconciliation. Harry did not forgive him, and William did not withdraw his position. But the conversation changed one thing that mattered immediately. Harry still refused to launch a public counterattack. The brothers left divided, yet their silence now carried a different meaning. Soon the decision would become public, and that private restraint would collide with a reaction neither man could control. For days, the decision had belonged to rooms the public could not enter. Then, in a single morning, it belonged to everyone. The royal announcement transformed a private family rupture into a national argument over blood, duty, loyalty, and the limits of royal identity. Yet one detail dominated the reaction more than the title itself. Britain was not only learning that Harry had lost his designation, it was learning that William had quietly helped convince the king. Charles heard the first wave of coverage as the palace statement spread across broadcasters and newspapers. The announcement confirmed the decision and stressed the distinction between private family relationships and active representation of the crown, meaning the difference between being related to the monarch and officially speaking or acting on behalf of the monarchy. Palace staff were told to update future references, correspondence standards, and official descriptions without adding emotional commentary. The goal was control. The effect was anything but controlled. Charles looked unsettled when the discussion shifted away from constitutional reasoning and toward the personal cost. Commentators stopped talking only about titles and began talking about a father removing one from his own son. The king had known the criticism would come, but hearing the decision reduced to that emotional truth gave it a different weight. The signature had been formal. The reaction was painfully human. William watched the focus turn toward him almost immediately. The prince had expected questions about his role, but the scale of attention made him more guarded. He had argued for clarity because he believed the future monarchy required it. Now that same decision was being presented as proof of how far his relationship with Harry had fallen. Protecting the institution had exposed the family wound even more clearly. The public moment arrived by evening. A fictional edition of the London Chronicle appeared with the front page. Harry no longer prince. William's private role in King's final ruling. Readers stopped outside a newsstand near Victoria Station, staring at the words as television crews captured the reaction. The story no longer belonged to royal corridors. It belonged to the country. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered as broadcasters argued over whether the move represented cruelty or clarity. Royal protocol, the formal rules governing how the monarchy operates and presents itself, had turned a private fracture into a public reality. Harry remained silent. Charles carried the burden. William absorbed the blame. The world could argue over winners and losers, but one truth now stood beyond debate. The title was gone, the decision was permanent, and each man had to decide what remained when the noise finally faded. In the end, there was no reversal, no dramatic restoration, and no last-minute compromise. Harry's prince title remained revoked. William did not withdraw the argument that helped convince his father, and Charles did not retreat from the order he had signed. The monarchy had drawn the clearest boundary yet between family and function. But clarity carried a human cost. 3 men walked away, knowing exactly what had been protected, and exactly what had been sacrificed. Harry understood that the order now stood as final. He would no longer use the prince title in an official capacity, and the monarchy treated the matter as settled, rather than temporarily suspended. The working monarchy, meaning the group of royals who actively carry out official duties on behalf of the crown, had now been defined more sharply. Charles had established that blood alone did not guarantee permanent public authority, and that principle would shape the institution William would one day inherit. Charles closed the same briefing folder that had carried the original order and placed it away without reopening it. There was no triumph in the gesture. The king had reached constitutional finality, meaning the decision had been formally settled with no expectation of reversal, but the personal cost remained. He had acted as sovereign in a way fatherhood would never have chosen easily, and the weight of that contradiction stayed with him. Harry accepted that the designation would not return. Acceptance did not mean forgiveness. It meant recognizing that continuing to fight for a royal identity already withdrawn would leave him trapped inside the same conflict indefinitely. For the first time, the loss itself forced a different possibility, building a future that no longer depended on restoring the place he once held. William carried a different burden. His private influence was no longer simply a secret intervention against his brother. It marked the moment the future king began acting according to the instincts of the role ahead of him, even when those instincts demanded a personal sacrifice he could never fully undo. Nobody truly won. William secured clarity. Charles secured finality. Harry gained separation from the role that had kept pulling him back into palace conflict. Yet all 3 lost another piece of the family bond they once shared. That became the final verdict. Harry lost a title. William crossed a painful threshold toward kingship. Charles accepted that protecting the crown could wound his own family. The institution emerged clearer, but the family emerged smaller. And that is where this chapter ends, not with reconciliation or revenge, but with permanence. A king who made the decision, an heir who helped shape it, and a son forced to build the rest of his identity beyond the title he once believed would always be his. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.